Hello everyone, and welcome to Game 6 of the 2018 World Chess Championship between Magnus, Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana. The previous 5 games have been drawn. If you haven't had the opportunity to check them out, I will put a link to all of the previous 5 games in the description below. And I would just like to make a very short announcement. As of today, I've been verified as as a valued member of the YouTube community, obviously, and YouTube has allowed me to have official YouTube merchandise. So as you can see in the top left corner, it says merch available, link in the description. I have one design ready that you can all check out, but I will get back to that after we check out this very nice game. So that being said, let's see what we have in store, and it's really an amazing game. A lot of us were wondering, will we ever see e4 and the Petrov in this World Chess Championship match, as Caruana has proven to be a deadly Petrov player, and how will Carlsen tackle it. So yes, this game does feature a Petrov, and it will be very exciting. But before that, we do have a couple of photos. Here we have a very nice photo. We can also use it as a photo challenge. Who is the woman that will make the first move for Magnus Carlsen? And as you can see, she's extremely excited to be making the first move, or perhaps she's just extremely thirsty. But here we have a move of her, a photo of her actually making the first move, but she does it in a very peculiar way. She didn't go over to Carlsen's side of the table and then pushed the pawn forward, but rather did it across the table, and it seems like a very awkward move to do with your hand. But maybe it's just me, I don't know. Seems a bit off. Yeah, who is the woman in the photo? Best of luck to everyone. Also, here we have a very nice photo of Magnus Carlsen. Not really a close-up, but almost. I thought you might enjoy it. And also, here we have a very nice photo of Caruana. There you have it. Really a masterpiece. So, like I said, all of the photos here are compliments of Nikki Riga, so do check out all of her other work. A link to her social media will be in the description below, so feel free to check that out as well. Now let's check out the game. Like we said, Carlsen has the white pieces, and he opens with e4 this time. And of course, when we saw e4, it was very much obvious that Caruana would go for his Petrov defense. We have e5, knight to f3, and the knight to f6. So the Petrov is on the board. Knight captures on e5, d6, kicking the knight back. And here, usually you will see the knight going back to f3. And there's like over 20,000 games played in international competition available in the database, but here Carlsen actually goes knight to d3, and there are actually very few games played with knight to d3. Fortunately for Caruana, he already played a game with knight to d3 when he defended against Wesley So in the 2018 Sinquefield Cup this year, so not really that much of a surprise to him. And okay, knight captures on e4, we have queen to e2, and now queen to e7, the only move available to black. Perhaps if you have this position with black in a blitz game, you could try f5, which leads to quite an interesting position. After f3, yes, you do lose a piece, but after knight to c6, pawn captures and knight to d4, white has to move the queen, and after queen d1, now comes f captures on e4. You force the white knight to move back. And here, a very interesting move, knight to f2 is what white has to play to keep his initiative. If white goes something like knight to f4, then his life is going to get very complicated, because you can surprise him. White is, of course, expecting queen h4, and then he will block with g3, but knight to f3 immediately with check. And here it would be a really crazy position, where white either has to start running away with his king or accept the knight, which then follows with queen to h4, and there is no g4 pawn, g-pawn to block the check. So here you would have to move the king e2, queen captures on f4, and now with the bishop pair and black will castle, bring the rooks into the game, it will be a very unpleasant position for white. But such things are for blitz. Here after queen to e2, queen e7 is the only good move. We have knight to f4. In the Sinquefield Cup that we already mentioned, Wesley So played knight to c3 against Caruana, and that game ended in a draw. Here, Carlsen goes for knight to f4. He wants to go for that d5 square to attack Caruana's queen. Knight to c6, and now comes knight to d5. Caruana's queen is under attack, and here we have knight to d4. Carlsen's queen is also under attack. Knight captures on e7, grabbing the queen. There's really no better move other than, sorry about that, other than capturing the queen. After knight d4, knight captures on e7. If you try something like moving the queen, there's really no good square to move the queen to. If you move the queen to d3, then you allow all sorts of nasty discoveries. If you move her to e3, then knight captures on c2 will simply win you the queen. So here, knight captures on e7. Knight captures on e2. Caruana also grabs Carlsen's queen. Knight back to d5, and now, interestingly, knight back to d4. So a lot of knight moves here. And here, knight to a3. You want to protect the c2 pawn. You don't want to do it with the king d1, because your other pawn becomes vulnerable. And you don't want to do it with bishop to d3, as after bishop to d3, you kind of block your own path here to development. You can't push the d pawn anymore, and so on and so on. So here, after knight to d4, we have knight to a3, guarding the c2 pawn. As the pawn on d6 is pretty much fixed, you don't have to worry about bishop capturing the knight. So here we have knight back to e6. You might argue that, okay, perhaps instead of this knight to a3 move, you could also try something like d3. But that doesn't work. Yes, white is also attacking the c7 pawn, but here after knight captures on c2 check, king moves, knight captures on a1. Yes, you can capture on c7 with check and capture the rook on a8, but now black gets the other rook as well. King e2, knight captures on h1, and here black is just up too much material. So after knight d4, knight to a3, as we already mentioned, we have knight to e6, and now comes f3, attacking black's knight. Knight 4 to c5, and now comes d4, kicking the knight back, and now we have knight to d7. Also possible here was c6, but after c6 you go into a series of exchanges, and obviously black was not interested in that. For example, captures on c5, captures on d5, captures on d6, captures on d6, and after bishop to e3. Yes, you can capture on a3 and mess up white's pawn structure, but you don't really want to give up the bishop pair for no apparent advantage here. So after d4, knight to d7, getting the knight out of here, and now c3. Carlsen makes room for his knight to go back into the game via knight c2 or knight e3. And here the e6 knight is stuck guarding the c7 pawn, so you do want to push the d5 knight back. c6 is played. We have knight to f4, offering a trade of knights, and now knight to b6. If the knight is captured, then bishop can capture on e6. We have bishop to d3. Carlsen develops his bishop. We have d5. D5 could also have been used as a nice square for this knight, but then developing the bishop on f8 would be somewhat troublesome. So d5, making room for the bishop to be developed, and now knight to c2. It's hard to say if Caruana was even considering capturing on a3, because if you start playing something like king f2 to get your rook into the game, capturing on a3 doesn't promise you all that much. After pawn captures, knight a4, going after the c3 pawn. Yes, white's pawn structure is crippled here, but still, with the bishop pair in such an open game, white should be all right. So after d5, we have knight to c2, getting the knight into the game, and also preventing bishop captures on a3. Bishop to d6, Caruana develops the bishop, also putting pressure on the knight on f4. Knight captures on e6, bishop captures on e6, and now king to f2. Carlsen finally makes room for his rook to enter the game. We have h5 by Caruana, preventing g4, and also expanding on the king side a bit, and now Carlsen does the same. h4 expands a bit on the king side, and also prevents a further expansion by Caruana on the king side. And here, Caruana decides to go for some active play. He wants to push c5, but still, you have to give further protection to the d5 pawn. So before doing it, first knight to d7. Not immediately, but first knight to e8, going for e7. We have knight to e3, and now comes knight to e7. Now the d5 pawn has extra protection, and also this knight can now go to g6 and f4 if needed. And interestingly, this is move 20, and we've already made 15 moves with the knight. So if you're just beginning, to learn how to play chess, you're just getting into chess principles, there is a principle that says you should not move the same piece twice in the opening, and here we already had 15 knight moves by move 20. This is what you can do when you're already, fully familiar with the principles and, you're fighting for the World Chess Championship title. Then you can just jump around with your knight. So, but otherwise, don't. G3, taking away all of these squares from black. And we have c5 now. Finally, Caruana decides to change the character of the position. He makes a pawn move, and now Carlsen has to react to this. Of course, you don't want to capture and allow bishop captures on c5, but you do expect Caruana to capture on d4 at some point, so you have to be ready for it. Bishop to c2, preparing for this rook to come to d1 and make his presence known across the d file. We have castles by Caruana, rook to d1, and now comes rook f to d8, countering Carlsen's rook on d1. Knight to g2. This knight is now here either to come to f4 or to prepare the development of this bishop on f4. Perhaps if the bishops are exchanged on f4, perhaps the knight can come to f4, threaten the h5 pawn, maybe weaken black's king side a bit. But who knows, it's still far too early to tell. Here Caruana goes pawn captures on d4, we have pawn captures on d4, and now rook 8 to c8 comes into the game with tempo, as it comes with an attack against the bishop on c2 that is undefended. Bishop to b3, and now comes knight to c6, putting pressure against the d4 pawn. We have bishop to f4, now offering a trade here, and of course black doesn't want to do it. If bishop captures, knight captures, then you're putting a lot of pressure on the d5 pawn, you're putting pressure on the bishop, you're putting pressure on the h5 pawn, so black would most likely have to weaken his king side by playing g6. So not something you want to do. First, knight to f5, knight to a5. You go after Carlsen's strong bishop on b3. As it is an open game, if you manage to get rid of the bishops, you're going to have some edge. Rook d to c1. This is a very interesting move because, first, when you look at this, you have a feeling that the only piece undeveloped from white is the rook on a1. So rook a to c1 might seem like an automatic, but then black can play captures on b3, and after pawn captures, you no longer have a rook on a1, which might be very useful. But also, there is an interesting comment by Alexander Grishuk, not the one that I used for a quote above the board, but that's also a very nice comment. Instead, rook d to c1 was played, and Grishuk said that whenever you're thinking which rook you're going to play to a certain square, you always pick the wrong rook, but it's only an illusion because your opponent will play differently, depending on which rook you play. And then after you get a certain position, you will say, oh, if only I played that rook to c1 and not this rook to c1. But then your opponent would have played it differently, and this position would never have been on the board. But here rook d to c1 seems better, because now if pawn captures and a captures, then you already have a rook attacking the a7 pawn here. And then most likely you would force black to trade here, and it would actually be white who would be controlling the open c file, the only open file on the board, and it would not be all that simple for black to counter it, as there is this tension between the two bishops. So perhaps would be better. So instead, bishop to b4, not capturing the pawn here immediately. And here bishop to d1. Here Carlsen moves the bishop, as now if you allow knight captures, then perhaps the pawn can come to a5 and create like a very solid structure here. So bishop to d1, and now we have knight to c4. And okay, the b2 pawn is under attack, so Carlsen defends it, he pushes it forward. We have b3, knight to a3, and now rook captures on c8. Rook captures and rook to c1, offering to trade down even the other pair of rooks. Knight to b5, now going after that d4 pawn, but also the c3 square is now weak in white's camp, so knight to c3 at some point will also, black will be able to put pressure against the a2 pawn as well. So rook captures, bishop captures, and now comes knight to e3. Now if knight captures here, it's been a very long game, over 6 hours. Knight captures on d5 would have been played, and as the bishop on b4 is under attack, you have to move it. Bishop to e3, attacking the knight. Also, if the knight moves to a wrong square, then the a7 pawn falls. So after knight to c6, it's still playable, but you've managed to push the black's pieces very, very much back. So after knight e3, we have knight to c3, defending the d5 pawn, and now bishop to c2 as the bishop was under attack, and now bishop to a3. A very nice move by Caruana that fixes the a2 pawn here on a light square, and this knight will capture it eventually. But here we have bishop to b8 by Carlsen, going after the a7 pawn. Pawn to a6, not allowing it to capture it, and now f4. And here we have bishop to d7. You still can't capture on a2 because this knight is still very much needed to defend the d5 pawn. So bishop to d7, and now comes f5. And here everyone felt Carlsen did make some progress here with this f4 to f5 move, because now it really prevents black from pushing g6. So if this knight could somehow maybe end up on f4, maybe it could attack. The h5 pawn also put pressure on g6, but you know, it's still far along the road. Bishop to c6, putting further protection to the d5 pawn, and now knight captures on a2 is definitely a possibility. Bishop to d1, and here Caruana interestingly doesn't capture this immediately. If he captured it immediately, then as Carlsen also attacked the h5 pawn, bishop captures on h5 would be played, bishop to b2, now going after the d4 pawn, and now bishop to a7, defending the d4 pawn. And now after knight goes back to c3, still black would really have to prove his advantage. But Caruana finds a nicer way. First, bishop to b2. Knight to e4 with check is a threat that would open up an attack from the bishop towards the d4 pawn. Carlsen captures the h5 pawn, and now we have knight to e4 check, as planned. King moves to g2, and now bishop captures on d4. So Caruana gave up the h5 pawn for Carlsen's very strong central d4 pawn, rather than going after the a2 pawn. Bishop to f4, defending the e3 knight, and here we have bishop to c5. Here, the path is very clear here. If Caruana can get his past d pawn pushing, then things are looking very, tough for Carlsen. And here bishop to f3. Bishop to f3 is is definitely the best idea. If you try something like knight to c2, not allowing this pawn to attack the knight and get it out of the way, then black would actually have a very nice game after pushing d4. Because now, after you bring the bishop to f3 to prevent this connection here, then black can play d3. And after you move the knight, now comes bishop captures, and here d2. And white simply doesn't have any move to play here. Whatever you play here, you cannot capture as the knight is defending it. If you capture with the bishop captures knight, then black can even just capture. After you move, you will get a queen into the game. There's really no good move to make, and whatever move you make, that's no good because there isn't a good move here. Then knight to g5, and again you're winning. There's a double attack against the f3 bishop, and of course d1 queen is a terrible threat. Of course, if you capture, then d1 queen, the bishop is pinned, you cannot capture the queen, and there would be really nothing to do here. You would have to capture this, and then knight captures on f3 would leave Carlsen down a piece. But still, it's very hard. Even with Carlsen's best defense, we have bishop to f3, now comes knight to d2, and here there were a couple of ideas Carlsen could have gone for, like knight to f1, but this leads to a very passive position for white. For example, knight captures, king captures, and now d4 opens up a discovered attack towards Carlsen's king. And now it's two bishops, so Caruana keeps his bishop pair, and Carlsen has a bishop and a knight. King e2, now comes bishop to b5 check, king e1, bishop to b4 check, and after the knight blocks bishop d3, white would have an extremely hard position to defend. So instead, Carlsen goes for a different approach. He decides to give his piece for 3 extra pawns. He plays bishop captures on d5, sacrifices a piece, and of course Caruana accepts. Bishop captures on e3, we have bishop captures on c6, and now bishop captures on f4. Bishop captures on b7. We have bishop to d6, getting his bishop out of the way, and now bishop captures on a6. So here Carlsen has his a pawn, his b pawn, and his h pawn, the 3 extra pawns we discussed, but Caruana is up a knight. So how can you do this? First, knight to e4, going after the g3 pawn. And here, g4 is played by Carlsen. It's interesting, if you try something like a4 to start your the pushing of the pawn as soon as possible, then black will in fact have time to grab your g3 pawn. Now you have to move the bishop to allow your pawn to move forward, and now after you move the bishop, now knight to h5 will be very nice, threatening knight f4 to win the bishop. And after you move the king, now comes bishop to b4, and you will no longer be able to push this pawn anywhere as the bishop is controlling all of the dark squares here. So, in fact, you would just have blundered your g pawn. So Carlsen pushes it. We have g4, bishop to a3, not allowing any pawns to be pushed forward, and now bishop to c4. After Caruana's knight attacks this c3 square, and the pawn on a2, Carlsen's plan is to push b4, and then the bishop will be defending the a2 pawn. King f8, there's no need to rush this, so better to get your king into the game as soon as possible. And now comes g5. We have knight to c3, and now Carlsen doesn't allow the a2 pawn to be captured, but rather he gives up the b pawn. Caruana captures it. You don't want to allow this pawn to be pushed to b5. We have bishop captures, king to f3. Carlsen wants to get his king into the game as soon as possible as well. Knight to a4, and now comes bishop to b5, attacking the knight, and the knight to c5. It's very interesting if knight to c3 is possible to attack the pawn and the bishop, but white can actually play a4, and after knight captures, pawn captures, white would be able to draw this, because after bishop to c5, preventing the b pawn from being pushed, white simply goes up, and after the bishop blocks, white goes further up. We have something like g6, king e5, we have check, king f6, pawn captures, king captures, and after king to g7, h5 now. King to g8, now comes h6, we have bishop to b6, and now king to f6, and after bishop to... Sorry about that. Bishop to d8 check. My throat is very dry for some reason. King to f5. We have king to h7, and now comes b6. You would give up this pawn. Black would have to capture it, and now you would approach the f7 pawn. King would have to defend it, and now g6. You are good to go. You will exchange the pawns, and now you can even make a little joke here. Black can give up a pawn and even stalemate a bishop, and even do a stalemate here. So after bishop to b5, knight to c5, we have a4, and now comes f6. King to g4. Also possible was g6, but Carlsen was reluctant to create this, as now it really fixes this pawn structure here. And of course, at some point, if the king makes his way down the board, then you want to push your h pawn and maybe force black to capture it to be able to push your g pawn. But if black just plays the bishop to d2 and controls the h6 square, it is very unlikely that this would happen. So, sorry about that. King to g4. We have knight to e4, and now comes king to h5. Again, g6. We already mentioned this, but we may just show it. It does fixes the pawn structure on the king side, but still it can get very dangerous. For example, if black isn't careful and goes something like this, then h6 would win the game for white after pawn to g7, as you will not be able to prevent queening here. So after knight e4, king to h5, and now comes bishop to e1, focusing on the h4 pawn. We have bishop to d3, and now comes knight to d6, getting out of the way, controlling the bishop on d3, and also pressuring the f5 pawn. And here we have a5 by Carlsen. Everyone was following the analysis of the supercomputer Sese, and Sese said that if g6 here, then it's actually the evaluation would be -3, but that's kind of normal since you are down a piece. So a5, Carlsen decides to give up the a5 pawn. We have bishop captures, and now pawn captures on f6. Pawn captures on f6, and now king to g6. getting the king into the position. We have bishop to d8, defending the f6 pawn. This was much needed. If you could play something like king to g8 and prevent king to h7, then that would be excellent for black. But unfortunately, you have to defend the f6 pawn. Bishop to d8, and now comes king to h7. A very important move, because if Carlsen played h5, it would be a different story. Then black can actually go king g8, take away the h7 square from Carlsen, and then after h6, you don't want to push h6. This will be pretty much the topic of the entire position. If you ever push the pawn to h6, then black will be able to attack the pawn and win it at some point. Sorry about that. I seem to be coming down with something. Bishop to b1, knight d4, bishop to a2, knight f3, and then at some point you will be able to check the white king on the e5 square. The king will have to move, and now you will just force it back with the bishop as well, and then finally win the h7 pawn. And this will now, of course, be winning. You will simply push the white king back, occupy the g5 square with your king, and then the knight will remaneuver itself to win the f5 pawn. So Carlsen, of course, doesn't want to do this. King to h7 was played, and now comes knight to f7. Bishop to c4 by Carlsen, and now comes knight to e5. Attacking the bishop, we have bishop to d5, and now bishop to a5. We have h5 by Carlsen, bishop to d2, and now bishop back to a2. We have knight to f3, and now comes bishop to d5. And this is sort of the theme of the position. Black would really want white to push h6, to put this pawn on a dark square where it can be attacked, but white wants to keep this. Pawn on f5, pawn on h5, and the king will always be able to protect both of the pawns by playing king to g6. And here we have knight to d4. If something like knight to e1, then king to g6, and if bishop to g5, you have to be careful. Here, if h6 is played, then you can even do something like knight to d3, h7, and knight to f4 checkmate. But of course, it is very unlikely for that to happen. After bishop to g5, you will of course not push h6. You can simply just move back, king to h7, and then all will be well once again. So after bishop to d5, knight to d4, and now we have king back to g6 by Carlsen. We have bishop to g5, bishop to c4, and here everyone in every possible live stream was screaming that this is a blunder and that black is now winning. And a lot of people were trying to figure out how black was winning, and no one could do it. Caruana in this position played knight to f3, which was again characterized as a blunder, and even later at the press conference, one of the news reporters in the press conference asked Carlsen that if he realized that bishop to h4, or Caruana, that this was actually winning. But I myself couldn't figure out how this was winning or why. If any of you have like a really exact evaluation and explanation of why this is winning, do share in the comments. Because they've shown this position to both Carlsen and Caruana in the press conference after, and they really had a hard time grasping that this was actually winning for black. And even after playing a couple of moves that were suggested by the computer, they still didn't seem convinced that this was actually winning. So of course, if you push h6, the win does come easy. But after something like bishop to d5, which is a move Carlsen immediately asked at the press conference, what happens then? Then knight to e2, but still you couldn't get a reasonable position. You're threatening knight f4 to win the bishop, but after king moves or bishop to f3, it will be very hard. But like I said, if anyone has like an exact explanation of why this would be winning for black, please do share. I couldn't have figured it out. But okay, after bishop to c4, we have knight to f3. King to back to h7, and now knight to e5, attacking the bishop, bishop b3. We have knight to g4, and now bishop to c4. We have knight to e3, bishop to d3, knight to g4, and now bishop to c4 back. Knight to h6, we have king to g6, king to e7. Caruana starts making away with his king into the game, as if he repeats knight g4 one more time, he will have fallen for the threefold repetition. Bishop back to b3, we have king to d6, bishop to c2, and now comes king to e5. So Caruana does make progress with his king, but we have bishop to d3, king to f4, bishop to c2, and now as there is no way to move the white king from protecting both of these pawns, there's very little black can do here. Knight to g4 was played, bishop to b3. If you go bishop to d1 and attack the knight, then knight to e3 attacks the bishop, and then after bishop moves, knight can capture on f5. But still, it would be questionable if you could actually win this position. Most likely there would be a way to do it, but still, it would be hard. You can't go king e5 because there's still no way to push f5. The bishop would be hanging, so you would have to go around king g4 to keep an eye on the bishop. But then again, bishop d1 check, king moves, you're controlling the f5 square. It would still pose you much problems. So just instead bishop to b3, knight to e3, and now h6. Finally, Caruana allows Carlsen to push h6, but now it is enough for him to draw. Here bishop captures on h6 is played, and it was in this position on move 80 that the players agreed to a draw. Why did they agree to a draw? Well, now after king captures on h6 and king captures on f5, it's a bishop against a knight, and a knight will not be able to outmaneuver the bishop to promote this pawn. One such line we can show is after the bishop simply moves and black makes room for start pushing his pawn. Bishop to b5, we can play f5. Bishop moves f4, now bishop here, the king comes closer, white king also approaches. We have f3, and now bishop to c6 check. Knight blocks, and now king attacks the pawn. We have pawn to f2, but now simply bishop to f5, b5. Knight to c3, attacking the bishop, but now simply king to g3. You're ignoring the bishop, you just want to grab the f2 pawn. King defends, we have bishop to c4, knight d2 check, king moves, and after knight g1, you can either just move the bishop back and forth, or even make a little joke, put the king to f1, and there will be no way to move you back and then promote the pawn to a queen safely. So yeah, after bishop captures on h6, the players agree to a draw, and game 6 now ends in a draw. Tomorrow we will have a rest today, and then we are continuing with round 7 on Sunday, where Carlsen will once again have the white pieces. So yeah, definitely an insane game, and really I knew that, well, I was presuming that the first time we will see the Petrov, we will have all hell breaking loose across the board. But yeah, how did you enjoy this? And really, if anyone finds like a really concrete explanation of why bishop to h4 was winning, please do share it. I should then show it in the next video. But yeah, like I mentioned, YouTube now allows me to have a merchandise area in my channel, so you will find a link to it in the description below. It will be the first thing you will see. For now, there is only one design, and it's actually this one. I've shown it a couple of months ago. I think it's more than 6 months. If you remember, I once did a Tal video where we had this position where a king and 2 queens was on the board, and I called it a chess threesome. You really enjoyed it, and then I asked one person here in my hometown, a colleague, he's also a designer, he works as a bartender. I just told him what happened, and that I wanted any kind of a design that resembles chess, that includes a chess threesome, and that I'm not gonna interfere. I just want him to do it the way he wants to do it, the way he sees it, and this is what he came up with. So in the description there will be t-shirts for men, t-shirts for women, like hoodies. There will even be some coffee mugs with this design. So I do hope you enjoyed it. I haven't still figured out all of the features this website offers, so I will look into it deeply. But this is just like a first design. Perhaps I'll even consider making it a limited edition, but we'll definitely see how it goes. Sorry, I'm definitely coming down with something. I have no idea what is happening. But yeah, that's the game. I would like to thank Thomas Kreuzenbrunner, Cyprian Popoviciu, Christopher Villea, Taras Karpiak, and Steve Miranda for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot, I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon tomorrow with a different video aside from the World Chess Championship, and on Sunday we continue with Game 7 of the World Chess Championship match. Thank you all, and I will see you soon.